If anyone thinks Europe as a whole can defend itself without the US, keep on dreaming.
For nearly 80 years, European allies slept soundly under the protective, nuclear-backed wing of the United States. America provided the muscle, the missiles, and the guarantee that an attack on one would be treated as an attack on all. And to even hint at backup options risked alienating the White House, giving Washington an excuse to pack up its troops and signalling weakness to the Kremlin. But welcome to 2026.
Europe needs to step up and take on its responsibility.
Behind closed doors, a dramatic shift is underway. European officials are actively weighing radical proposals to defend the continent against a Russian assault on their own. What would it take for Europe to defend itself from Russia? And how did we get to the point where Europe can no longer depend on its greatest ally? A constant during Trump's years in power has been his berating of NATO allies and constant threats of abandonment.
We've been protecting these countries for years with NATO, because NATO is us.
And as it turns out, Trump has always been resentful of how much the US was contributing to the alliance versus the rest of the group.
If you look at the payments that we're making to NATO, they're totally disproportionate with everybody else's, and it's ridiculous.
In more recent times, a series of high-pressure moves from the Trump administration have tipped the scales further. From the aggressive campaign to annex Greenland, a NATO member's territory, to coercing Europeans into a confrontation with Iran, to the sudden cancellation of long-range Tomahawk cruise missiles and the withdrawal of thousands of US troops from European soil, the message from Washington has become impossible to ignore. Trust, once the invisible glue of the Atlantic Alliance, has quietly corroded. European electorates have noticed. A fresh poll of 12 nations reveals rock-bottom public confidence in the US as an ally. Only 35% of Britons, 27% of Germans, and a measly 22% of Swedes trust that the US would actually come to their defence if attacked. To put that in context, more Europeans now trust their own national governments to handle a security crisis than they trust Washington. The fear is that a Russian incursion into a Baltic state, say, would be treated by Washington as a minor regional skirmish, not worth risking American lives over, and that the political fallout from such a non-response would destroy NATO and the EU as functioning institutions. If you can't rely on the American nuclear umbrella, you build your own. Under proposals currently being discussed in security circles, a so-called nuclear hedging coalition could form. Non-nuclear states like Germany, Poland, Sweden and Ukraine could start sharing advanced nuclear technologies, dual-use infrastructure and delivery systems. The goal isn't to become nuclear powers overnight, it's to bring these countries right to the threshold, close enough that Moscow could never be certain they wouldn't cross it. A last resort Plan Z warning: launch a warhead at Europe and you'll be facing an instantly atomic continent in return. It sounds like science fiction, but public support is already surging. 65% of Poles and 56% of Swedes say they would back a national atomic arsenal. In Germany, a country that has spent 80 years deliberately avoiding any such discussion, the debate is now happening in mainstream politics. So let's get specific. Let's imagine a European NATO member has been invaded by Russia. This triggers Article 5, the alliance's founding guarantee. An armed attack against one NATO member shall be considered an attack against all members. More importantly, it triggers an obligation for each member to come to its assistance. Article 5 has only been formally invoked once since it was drafted in 1949, after the September 11th terrorist attacks against the United States. For it to be effective, the decision to invoke Article 5 has to be unanimous. Every member state gets a vote. So what happens if one ally, say the United States, refuses to participate? The answer, according to the proposals now being quietly circulated, you bypass the US entirely. The blueprint suggests reorganising European defence around regional coalitions built directly on NATO's existing joint force commands. There are two principal joint force commands in Europe, one covering the central and eastern flank, the other the Mediterranean. Under the new proposals, they would be given what are called pre-delegated powers. If a member state is attacked, these regional coalitions activate automatically. No waiting for a consensus in Washington. The strategy outlines a surprisingly aggressive posture designed to deter Vladimir Putin, not just from invading, but from even contemplating it. The proposals explicitly mention seizing chunks of Russian territory, including the heavily armed semi-exclave of Kaliningrad, wedged between Poland and Lithuania, to use as bargaining chips. The logic: if Russia wants to negotiate an end to the conflict, it has to come to the table knowing Europe holds something it wants back. This regional strategy is backed by a major independent study overseen by former Finnish President Sauli Niinisto, a figure with serious credibility given that Finland only joined NATO in 2023 after decades of careful neutrality driven by exactly the threat Russia now poses. The study outlines wiring together a powerful sub-NATO alliance of Europe's strongest military players: France, Germany, Poland, the Nordic states and the UK. A coalition capable of generating real military mass without waiting for American permission. Defence analysts are increasingly confident that this core coalition could realistically defeat a Russian incursion with only minimal US assistance. Basic intelligence feeds, satellite targeting data, logistical support. Not boots on the ground, not aircraft carriers, just the tools that keep the machine running. Think of it as a pragmatic de facto division of labour. No grand treaty, no signing ceremonies in Brussels, the British focus on the North Sea and the High North. The Poles and Germans anchor the eastern flank, the French provide the nuclear backstop and the expeditionary capacity. It sounds seamless, except for one glaring problem: Great Britain. While the continent scrambles to prepare, Britain is being widely criticised as a complacent outlier, a country that talks the language of global leadership while quietly hoping someone else does the heavy lifting. Allied diplomats are reportedly exasperated by London's refusal to engage seriously with these backup plans. For decades, every single UK strategic defence review has started with a whiteboard that says US primacy first and NATO second. The assumption that Washington will always be there has become so deeply embedded in British strategic culture that challenging it almost feels disloyal. Senior defence experts now warn that Britain has essentially outsourced its strategic thinking to the Americans and is entirely unequipped for a world where that outsourcing is no longer an option. Unsurprisingly, you won't find NATO ambassadors openly debating these radical options during formal sessions. No one wants to officially reform the alliance's institutions just yet. Doing so would risk sending exactly the signal Washington wants, that Europe has given up on American involvement. And so the dance continues, publicly committed to the old architecture, privately building the new one. Some former senior officials argue that improvising a European response in a crisis might be better than building a rigid, elaborate architecture beforehand, noting that NATO has a history of landing on its feet like a cat. The alliance has surprised skeptics before, but relying on luck is no longer a strategy. As European policymakers point out with increasing urgency, they no longer have the luxury of sitting around and hoping for the best. Russia has fought a land war in Europe for 4 years. The United States has made clear, repeatedly, unmistakably, that its commitments are conditional, and China is watching everything. Whether Europe builds a nuclear hedging coalition, activates pre-delegated joint force commands, or quietly wires together a sub-NATO alliance of the willing, one thing is becoming undeniable. The era of unconditional reliance on Washington is over. Europe is learning to stand on its own 2 feet, because when it comes to continental survival, waiting for permission from across the Atlantic is a luxury it can no longer afford.